Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. As editors, one of our primary jobs is to help authors to make their argument in the best, clearest, and most persuasive way possible. Unfortunately, that can be a challenge. Out of the submissions that we receive at Texas National Security Review and at War on the Rocks, only about 15% find their way to eventual publication. In a recent summer seminar on History and Statecraft at Beaver Creek, Colorado, sponsored by the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, Managing Editor of Texas National Security Review, Dr. Megan Oprea, and myself gave a talk on the ins and outs of publishing and editing. Since this is something that many people have asked about, we felt it might be worth reprising this for an episode of Horns of a Dilemma. While the talk is geared specifically towards TNSR and War on the Rocks, I think it applies for anyone who writes professionally as a means of getting across their message, persuading, and providing analysis. Without further ado, let me turn to my colleague, without whom Texas National Security Review would not be what it is, since she has looked over literally every word that has appeared in the publication. Megan.
Hi, Doyle. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I am Megan Oprea, Managing Editor of the Texas National Security Review and Senior Editor at War on the Rocks. I've been with TNSR pretty much since the beginning when we launched in October 2017. And prior to that, I did my PhD work at UT. But yeah, since 2017, I've just been editing everything that goes into our publication and making it run alongside Doyle.
Since you need some sort of framework for our talk, what we used when we spoke at Beaver Creek and what seems to work well is the framework that many of us learned in secondary school about how it is that we should write a paper or what a journalist should address, which is the 5 W's and the H: what, where, who, why, when, and how. So I'm going to begin actually with the who. And who works in two different ways. First, there's a question of who it is that's writing. Because each of us have a unique set of experiences, a unique expertise, a unique perspective, a unique voice. And our writing is most powerful when we write to what we know. And this can be challenging because we live in an age when pundits are almost everywhere. There are a few who you can probably think of, I'll spare naming them for the podcast, who make a living by weighing in on almost any issue. And there are many issues on which they may have expertise, and then there's issues on which they also weigh in. Write what you know. This is one of the most important things because you're going to bring to it then the expertise, the experience, the perspective that others don't have. They will come away informed by what it is that you've done, and your voice will be authentic. Megan, has that been your experience and what you've encountered from folks?
Yeah, absolutely. You can tell when somebody is writing what they know. Their writing ends up being more natural often, although it can get a little too zoomed in, but you can just tell they're comfortable with the topic, and it reads better, it comes across better, but I think it also reaches the audience better. The audience is more receptive to listening and being convinced, or at least considering an argument if it comes from somebody who has experience, whether academically or professionally, in a topic.
So the other question about who is who it is you want to read what it is that you're writing. And that affects both the way in which you write and where it is that you seek to place your writing. If you're interested in writing something that moves experts in a particular field, you want to write in the places where those experts read and get their information from. So if your argument is principally a legal argument, you may find that a specialist outlet like Lawfare or Just Securio or Opinio Juris are really well suited to reaching your audience. If your argument is about national security, War on the Rocks is one of the premier outlets for that. If you have a policy-relevant academic argument, Texas National Security Review is terrific. On the other hand, if you're an economist who is seeking to gain tenure and needs to write in a way that influences the people who will make a decision on your tenure, you're probably better served by writing for a disciplinary-focused journal. And when you do that, you're going to write differently because you're going to write according to the norms of the discipline. I think this is one of the skills that Megan really brings to her editing, is helping people who are accustomed to writing in a very discipline-specific way to write in a way that's accessible and clear even to people who lack the formal training in that discipline.
Yep, absolutely. And that's something I'm going to get into a little bit more when I get into some specifics about how to actually write clearly and write for different kinds of audiences. But absolutely trying to get somebody a little bit outside of their siloed discipline, like disciplinary style, and getting them to write in a way that is still relevant to their discipline, but can also be clear to folks that are not experts in that particular area. That's can be a really big challenge for people, but it is an important part of when you're crafting your argument, when you're writing, and when you're choosing where to submit, is really thinking about who your audience is and what the purpose is of your article or your piece that you're writing.
Yeah, and in the political science field, one of the things that really struck me about this is the use of the phrase endogeneity. And it's a phrase that I had never heard before I went back to grad school in political science. And for weeks, I was sitting in the seminar and someone would raise their hand and say, well, I think you may have an endogeneity problem. And I was baffled by what that meant, but too embarrassed to ask what it meant because everybody else would nod sagely and tug on their chin. And it turned out all it really meant is that they had their causal arrow the wrong way, that the effect was the cause or the cause was the effect, or at least you couldn't tease out which one was which. But if all you said was, well, I'm not sure which your cause and which is your effect, then why are you in a PhD program? You got to say it's an endogeneity program. But I think what we really try to do is to make it different than that.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of what we do and what we're trying to do at TNSR especially is how do you get across these ideas in a way that is digestible and not that doesn't make you cringe, which for me, when you said endogeneity, I literally cringed. So yeah, you sure do have an endogeneity problem.
So the other thing about where is that that's also going to affect one of the most important things you can do, which is if the outlet that you're writing for has submissions guidance, please read the submissions guidance and follow it. It sounds really simple, but how often do we run into authors who we spend a significant portion of our time saying, hey, in accordance with our submissions guidance, we prefer to do things this way?
Yeah, it's a hugely frustrating thing and does not start things off on a good foot with you and the editor. Sometimes it can be overcome, but yeah, it's definitely that you definitely want to start out on the right foot by actually delivering something that fits with the publication and is in the format that the publication has asked for. If it says submit in Word, do not submit in anything other than Word.
So the next two questions I want to address, we've talked about who and where. Let's talk about what and why. Because there are a variety of different types of articles that can be written, and that really depends in part on where you're going to place it and on how you're going to do it. And it also really, again, goes to what it is the publication tries to do. Because very often I'll get submissions at Texas National Security Review that are interesting, they're well written, but they don't have an academic argument per se. They are really good policy analysis, but there's no academic question and really no methodology that's used in order to do it. And that's frustrating because I enjoy reading the article. I think it's got a good point, but it's not a good fit for us. And so I'm left trying to make recommendations as to where it might be a good fit, but trying to understand what it is that the outlet that you're submitting to publishes really, really helps in improving the odds of being in that 15% rather than being in the 85% who aren't successful in placing their publication where they are. And that also goes to why it is that you're writing. Are you writing to persuade? Are you writing to inform? Are you writing to both persuade and inform? Ideally, that's kind of where we like the sweet spot for War on the Rocks as well as Texas National Security Review, is that we want you to inform readers about an argument, persuade them of the validity of that argument, and lead them to conclusions about the importance of that argument as it relates to a policy question. But there's other types of writing that are equally valid, really enjoyable to read, but don't work well in these sorts of outlets. And so there's writing that is principally a backgrounder, for example. There's writing that is a review of the literature on a subject. There's writing that is speculative in its analysis. Oftentimes this takes the form of a short story or something that is perhaps a vignette, but maybe something that's broader and done at a larger scale. And all these are good and interesting forms. But again, it goes to where it is that you're going to submit what it is that you've written. There are two types of articles that I think are particularly hard, however, to make work. And I'll mention it largely because I know that we have a lot of graduate students among our listeners and among those who submit. One is to try to take the argument from a PhD dissertation and distill it into an article. Part of the reason that's hard is the PhD dissertations expect a different type of writing than the sort of thing that you're going to sit down and read for pleasure or information. Megan, do you know, has anyone other than your committee or your family read your dissertation? I'm sure that in my dissertation, that's no one else has, but how about yours?
Absolutely not. I don't think anyone's ever read it. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's for a very specific audience. It's a very specific purpose. You are trying to achieve something very specific, which is getting out of graduate school. Yeah, so that's an exceptionally challenging document to transfer or to gear toward another purpose.
The other type that I think is very difficult is to try to take a good seminar paper and turn that into a successful academic article. And again, it's because they're designed to do different things. A good seminar paper shows that you've done some research, you have a command of the literature, and that you can draw some reasonable conclusions from it. But it's not asking for you to do anything that is new or original. Whereas a scholarly article is trying to make a new contribution to the scholarship on a particular topic. And I know that in my case, I was never taught that distinction. And so I submitted at least 3 very good, frankly, seminar papers, all of which were rejected properly by the journals to which that I had submitted them. And I was like, boy, these guys just stink. They have terrible judgment. And with the benefit of having eventually learned what it is that's different about it, I realized why they were declined. But it's frustrating to try to help an author turn something that is really good scholarship for the purpose at which it was written, but doesn't fit well for the audience they're trying to reach with it now. So having talked about who and what, where and what and why, I'll talk very briefly about when, but then I think it's really time to turn to the interesting part, which is how. So the only thing I'll say about when is that if you are trying to tie a piece of writing to a particular date, event, anniversary, please give the editors a reasonable amount of time to process it and to take a look at how it fits in their lineup or whether it fits in their lineup. That's a minimum of 2 weeks. I've literally had the experience of having an author contact me at 4 p.m. on November 10th and say, hey, I've got a great piece for you for Veterans Day. And it may, in fact, be a great piece for Veterans Day next year, but it's not going to work for November 11th of this year. So please, if it is tied to an anniversary, a month is actually a very reasonable period of time if you know that, because you're not really taken by surprise by the fact that July 4th comes on July 4th this year. So if you've got a July 4th piece, get it in by June 4th if you can. So having talked about who, where, what, why, and when, let's turn to the interesting stuff, the nitty gritty. Let's turn to how. And Megan, I'll let you kick us off here.
All right. Yeah. How is where I live. I'm just briefly where I'm going to go with this, give some broad comments about writing and the writing process, and then talk about some specifics, some real nitty gritty stuff, and then talk about the editing process, and all of which Doyle has ample experience in. So I expect some chiming in. So Doyle sort of touched on some of this, but you're not going to persuade anybody, and you're not going to inform anybody, and you're not going to achieve your goals in writing if no one can understand what it is that you're writing. This seems like common sense, and yet we often get submissions that have good ideas, but it's really hard to find them. And if I'm having a hard time finding them as the editor, well, then your average reader is going to have a heck of a hard time finding them and may end up just giving up. So really focusing on this idea of clarity and being able to be understood is very important. It doesn't matter what you're writing. It could be an academic paper, a policy brief, an intelligence report. You want your audience to understand you. So how can you be understood? That's what I'm going to try to get into today. Another thing that a lot of people really, really struggle with is this idea that, well, if I'm clear, then I'm not being rigorous, as though there's somehow this false dichotomy between rigor and clarity. And a lot of times this comes from trying to write within your academic discipline, like Doyle, like you mentioned. And so people want it to fit in. They want it to sort of hit all the buzzwords and the jargon words. And that is exactly what we don't want you to be doing at TNSR. we're working really hard to avoid jargon, to avoid it being something that you're slogging through, that as a non-expert that you wouldn't be able to understand. You want folks from history to be able to read a political science article and be able to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, I think I get the gist of it. Maybe I don't understand every academic, reference or whatever, but I'm more or less tracking. And that's sort of our goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Megan. And one way in which I try to do that is I try to make sure that I have an audience in mind when I'm writing and editing, not only for who it is who I want to read and be influenced by the article, but who and how I think they're going to understand the article. So in my case, I often think about my brother, who is extremely smart, has had a very successful career in the Silicon Valley world, and yet doesn't have any particular training in security studies or military affairs. So if you require that specialized training to understand it, it's probably not a good fit and probably not expressed as clearly as possible. And so it's not that it can't be rigorous, but it's that it has to be written in a way where someone who lacks the particular background that you have can understand the argument that you're making. And indeed, that's the whole reason why we want someone to write from their expertise, is we want you to make your expertise accessible to people who don't have that same background and experience.
Absolutely. And I'm a big proponent of you can write for two audiences at once. You can do that. You can effectively write an article that folks in your field will totally get, will understand the importance of it, but that a non-expert will also read and get the gist of it. You can do both those things at once. And so I've always tried to encourage authors along those lines, although they're not always convinced. But in part of writing clearly, part of the importance of it is in the context of the internet age. People have very short attention spans, especially when they're reading online. And so that's another reason to be clear, because you want people to actually finish your article, whether it's a War on the Rocks length article or a TNSR length article. They have to read the whole thing. And that can be challenging if they're slogging through, difficult prose, jargon, or just unclear writing. So we really want to focus on that. And, I always tell people that there's no concept so complicated that it can't be written clearly. That includes writing about AI, cyber stuff, and maybe it could even be written like somewhat beautifully, possibly. So let's talk about how to actually do that. So there's two main things to focus on. One is structure and one is prose style. It's like Doyle said, you want to know where you're publishing and why you're publishing what you're publishing, and these things are all important. And then you need to know exactly what your article is and where you're going with it. It's good to have a general elevator pitch. You want to be able to have that so that you could tell somebody like, hey, this is what my article's about, and these are my main points and this is my conclusion. So you should be able to do that first before you ever start writing. And that's important because if you don't know all of those things, if you don't know your full elevator pitch, then you're not going to know where to publish it. You're not going to know where to submit it. And then this may seem very elementary, but write an outline. Outlines are incredibly useful tools to make sure you know where you're writing, and they will make the writing process go so much faster and so much more smoothly because you already have your structure set up. You know exactly what you're going to write.
So I think another piece of that, Megan, that really helps is to make sure that you write in a deductive, not an inductive manner. So what do I mean by that? I mean, start with your argument and then follow with the evidence that supports it. I actually really enjoy reading mystery novels. It was kind of my escape when I was in grad school. If I needed to get away from stuff that was just bogging down my reading speed and full of words like endogeneity, I would pick up a good detective novel. And I love in a detective novel when I can't figure out who did it until the end. But the reason detective novels are different from good academic writing is that if I can't figure out what the author's saying in an academic article until the end, the odds of my ever getting to the end are much, much lower. So please don't write like you're Agatha Christie. Tell us up front what you're going to tell us. Tell us what you told us. It sounds elementary. It doesn't preclude writing well, but it absolutely enables writing clearly.
No, absolutely. I mean, the 5-paragraph paper, right? It is elementary, but it's elementary for a reason. It's foundational. This is how you make an argument. And I know that not everybody agrees with that. The French academic writing, they like to sort of keep it hidden and slowly unravel and reveal to you what the argument is that they're making. But that's not how we do things. I disagree with the French there and in other places as well. But the idea is that you want to make things easy for your reader. Your reader shouldn't have to work for it. They shouldn't wonder and guess. So you want to tell them what you're going to do it, and then tell them what you just did. Because you don't want your reader getting lost. You want to give them signposts.
So the other thing about that is also thinking about how it is that you're going to begin the article. And we refer to that as the lead. And the power of a good lead is hard to underestimate. So I'm going to read two leads, and Megan by now knows where these come from, but I'll let you as a listener think about which one you'd rather read. So let's begin with this one. I write this book with three aims in mind. First, to examine theories of international politics and approaches to the subject matter that make some claim to being theoretically important. Second, to construct a theory of international politics that remedies the defects of present theories. And third, to examine some applications of the theory constructed. So, it's not terrible. It actually does what we just said. It says, let's tell them what you're going to tell them. That's very clear from that, what's going to come out. It's also pretty clear from it that unless you are really interested in theories of international politics, you're unlikely to read much further in that particular article. So let's try this one. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. They have greatly increased the life expectancy of those of us who live in, quote, advanced countries, unquote, but they have destabilized society, have made life unfulfilling, have subjected human beings to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering, in the third world to physical suffering as well, and have inflicted severe damage on the natural world. Now, you may not be clear after hearing that what that article is going to be about, but you're likely intrigued. Interestingly, that article was written by a mathematician who had some problems with compliance with authority and living in society. His name was Theodore Kaczynski, and you may know him better as the Unabomber. That's part of the 35,000-word manifesto that was published as part of the terms under which he turned himself into authorities. But the lesson here is that a good lead can make even an unhinged rant sound interesting.
Yeah, a good lead is a good lead. I don't care who you are. Well, no, that segues great into what I was going to say about introductions and how you frame up your article. And it really, different venues and different kinds of writing, you're going to have slightly different kinds of leads. For a shorter article like War on the Rocks, your lead needs to catch the person, right out of the gate. You don't want to leave them sort of, people aren't going to keep reading, right? With an academic article, it's a little bit different, but you still do want to capture your reader. You want to give them a sense of the context. Why are we going to talk about this topic? Like right off the bat, like first couple of sentences. It's incredibly important. And then for an academic paper, as well as other writing, but specifically for an academic paper, you really want to give the reader the highlights and then map out where you're going. Especially for these longer 10 to 20,000 word articles, you really don't want your reader guessing, right? Another really important thing in an introduction of any kind is that you want to make sure that you keep your promises. So if you tell your reader that you're going to do X, Y, and Z, well, then you better darn well do X, Y, and Z in the body of the paper. And guess what? If you, in your paper, do X, Y, and Z, plus you throw in a B and a C, well, then you need to go back to your introduction and make sure to add that B and C to your introduction. That's just really important that you're setting up expectations and then you meet those expectations.
That's an interesting thing as well, is that if your paper has a bunch of things that aren't in the original statement, the tendency is to think, well, I can solve this. I'm just going to go back to the original statement and I'm going to add those things to it. And there are times when that is the right thing to do. But I would also encourage an author to think that this is a minute for a little bit of introspection about why they weren't in the original statement of what it was that the paper was going to achieve and whether they're really essential to the argument. Because it's easy to go down the road of things that are interesting, related, but not actually necessary. And cutting those out, the phrase kill your darlings, is one of the most difficult and important parts of editing.
Absolutely. This is a huge problem. You don't want, just because you put it in your body, doesn't mean it needs to be go back and put it in the introduction. But so you really have to have a sort of a come to Jesus moment with yourself when you're self-editing like that. And the same is true on. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would also say, if you think you've done that, but what you've actually done is put it into a footnote instead, you haven't really done it. And I did that throughout my dissertation and other writing. There were things I really, really was attached to. I was like, oh, I need to cut that. And I put it into a footnote. And then I looked and like the word count, was like almost twice as much including footnotes as it was not including footnotes. I'm like, maybe I'm using footnotes for a purpose other than that for which they're intended.
Yeah, and a great way to sort of help yourself with that, and it can kind of ease the pain of making cuts to your article, is to keep a separate Word document. I used to always call it the cutting room floor, and keep a separate Word document so that you can grab stuff that you think, I'm not sure that this really belongs in this paper, but I really can't bear to part with it like for good. Put it over there. You'll have it. It'll be saved, and you can either use it for a future paper, or if you decide in the end, this really needs to be in here, you have it. You can just grab it. And it just makes it a little easier instead of just pressing that delete button, which is so permanent feeling.
Yeah, I called mine the discard bin, but I like cutting room floor better. That's a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah, it's a little more optimistic. And when I was writing my dissertation, I had a separate one for each of my chapters so that I could keep it organized as well, which if any of y'all are listening and are working on your dissertations, you might try that out. A lot of times where this comes up, this idea of cutting things that don't pertain, as we're talking about structure and sort of the big picture of your paper, but it applies even as you come down from to the section level and to the paragraph level. Everything that you put in in each section, you need to make sure it belongs there. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you have a clear introductory paragraph for every section in which you are really setting up for the reader, this is what this section is going to be about. This is what I'm doing, and this is why. You want to leave that signpost for your reader. And if you go through your section and you realize like, hey, maybe like these 2 paragraphs at the end don't really pertain to that thesis that I stated at the beginning of the section, well, then that it should go. But the only way you're going to know that is if you have a clearly defined thesis at the beginning of every section. And then the same thing applies to a paragraph. I so often have to leave comments for authors and say, hey, like based on how you open this paragraph, this is what the reader's going to expect the paragraph to be about, but you're kind of wandering and there's, it's not all about one thing. And that can be hard to see. So that's a really good way in terms of self-editing, is to go through and see if your sections have a thesis and then see if your paragraphs have a topic sentence. It doesn't need to be clumsy, and it doesn't have to say in this paragraph I will talk about, but it should still be something that cues to the reader and gives them a sense of where this is going.
I think a great way to think about that is that if somebody only read that section, it should be able to stand alone as a paper. Now, granted, it's obviously a much smaller portion of the argument. It might not be an interesting paper if it doesn't tie into the other things that make it interesting and important. But it should be something where if someone only saw that part, they would come away understanding what that part was about clearly and didn't rely on things that were outside of it in order to understand what it was saying.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And part of that is making sure that you wrap up your section with some kind of takeaway, some kind of indication to your reader. Why did I just write this section? What was the purpose of it? You don't need to be overly repetitive. You don't want your wrap up, if it's a short section, you don't want the wrap up of that section to be as long as the section itself, but just something that closes it out, bookends it, and then helps transition into the next section will make each section be able to be a standalone. Which is really important for keeping your reader tracking along with you, which is your ultimate goal. Because if the reader's not reading, then then your writing isn't going to go anywhere. And then the last thing is the conclusion, which you want to restate to some extent what you just wrote. You don't need to write it verbatim, but you want to give a little sum up. And part of this is helpful for readers who maybe got a little lost along the way. Maybe it's a long paper. Maybe they read half of it last week and now they're coming back and reading the other half. So you want the conclusion to sort of remind them, be like, oh yeah, okay, that's where we started from, and then this was the road that we took, and this is how we got here. But you also want to tell them why it's important. What are the implications? And if you're writing for TNSR, you want to talk about the policy implications. Why should a policymaker care about this? What is this doing and adding to the conversation? So one of the big takeaways for talking about the structure is signposting and also connecting the dots. So signposting, we've talked a lot about, thesis sentences, things like that. You want to leave a breadcrumb trail for your reader because you want them to follow you as you're going, like I just said. And the other thing is to connect the dots. A lot of times authors, they understand how two concepts connect and they understand how they got from one to the other. But it's not always clear to the reader, especially for a reader who may not be well versed in that particular topic or that particular area of history. So as a writer, you need to remember your readers cannot read your mind. So anything you want your reader to know, you'd better write it. And so that's where you want to have a lot of sort of connective tissue between sentences and make sure that the reader can make the jump from one idea to the next. So let's just talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty of actually writing. So we've talked about the structure, how to signpost, how to keep your readers tracking with you, but let's talk about how to actually, some tips about how to actually make the reading of the prose enjoyable. So one of them is what Doyle mentioned earlier, writing for a generalist. And like he said, think of a specific person. Don't just say, hey, I think I'm vaguely writing for somebody who's a non-expert in this area. No, think of a specific person. And then you might even actually have that person read your article if they like you enough and are willing to do it. I have a specific person in mind that I think of when I'm editing. Could this person who's very well educated, who's a lawyer but knows nothing about this topic, would they be able to more or less get the gist of this, right? Another tip, as this I think is especially for younger authors, folks who are just finishing their dissertation and finishing their PhD work, don't try to write impressively. If you try to write with the goal of impressing someone or some audience, it's just your writing is going to be muddled. You're not going to be as clear as you think, and the prose is actually probably not going to be that good. So the main thing, especially early in your career, is just to write clearly. I would argue everyone should have that goal, but I think that this is something that can be hard starting out when you want to try to make sure that the right people are reading it and the right people are understanding. Just write clearly. And along those lines, I don't want to say never use a thesaurus, but use a thesaurus with caution. I have edited papers before where it's very clear that the author, with good intentions, used a thesaurus way too much. And so there's just these words that they kind of mean what the author is meaning, but they don't really get at it. And it's sort of unnecessarily out of the ordinary, You don't want any endogeneities in there, although that's a little more on the jargon side.
Yeah, and I think for me, I find when I'm writing that oftentimes there will be a word that I unconsciously repeat frequently. And that's a great time to use a thesaurus because I'm just not thinking well enough to come up with an alternative to that word in my writing. And so having a kickstart for that works well. But it isn't that I'm looking for the most number of syllables in a synonym. I'm looking for something that expresses the same meaning or nearly the same meaning as closely as possible, or maybe more appropriately than the word I was misusing, and trying to do that to help me avoid unnecessary repetition.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's a great point. Use a thesaurus when you are repeating the same word over and over again, which we all do. We all have these tics of these phrases or words that we use over and over. And because they kind of, we use them as a crutch because it helps us get over either writer's block or difficulty expressing a thought. So we go back to the same phrase, and that's okay. But you just got to make sure to find it and get rid of it. Thesaurus is great. Using a thesaurus when you're like, okay, I know the right word, but I'd like to sound a little smarter. Don't use a thesaurus. Walk away. Take a break from writing.
I had a professor who told me to make every idea as simple as possible, but no simpler.
That's absolutely right. Yep. You make it as, it's, and because making it as simple as possible doesn't mean that it's a simple idea. And it doesn't mean that you're writing, for some audience that isn't the audience you have in mind. It's just writing clearly. And that's a great way to approach it. And so that kind of segues into the discussion of the use of jargon. Especially at TNSR and the War on the Rocks, we just really want to move away from that. There's this idea that if you don't use the jargon, then no one can understand, when in reality, it's quite the opposite. Using the jargon can often make it really hard to understand someone's argument. And it's not necessary, and it just makes for clunky reading. Now, that said, there are cases where you do have to use some phrase or word because it is the phrase or word that is used in that field. And in that case, you can work around it, but give an explanation of what it means and try to situate it. So it's not just this random word that the reader has to deal with and just kind of clunkily, vaguely kind of know what it means. So help the reader out if you do have to use jargon, although I argue it's rarely necessary.
Yeah, I think a good example of that, we had an article recently on applying the concept of ontological security to the conflict in Ukraine. And there wasn't another word or phrase that conveyed exactly what ontological security meant. But the author provided a good plain language definition of it early in the article so that it didn't require that you be immersed in the field to understand it.
Absolutely. And he did a great job of that. And another sort of tactic you can use is you can say it in this plain language at the beginning, or give a definition of it or an explanation of it. And then you can also drop a little anchor for your reader later on. Let's say you hit page 12. You can refer to ontological security or some other topic. You can refer to it again in that simple language just to kind of re-up for the reader. Like, okay, yeah, just to make sure that they're still understanding that phrase in the right way. Which again helps you because you want them to understand your argument. That's your number one goal as a writer. Another piece of advice for writing in a way that is goes easy on your reader, makes it easier for your reader, is to vary your sentence length. And this might seem really simple, but it's huge. It's a hugely important aspect of being a good prose stylist. I think that people are afraid of short sentences. And so they just string clauses together and just throw semicolons in there. And, that there's a place for that too. You do want varying lengths. You want short and long, but you want the mix. And if you are going to try to do a multi-clausal sentence, you have to make sure it's grammatical. And that can be really hard. We're not really used to diagramming our sentences anymore, but it's a good practice. But yeah, so make sure you can vary those sentence lengths. That just makes for easier reading and more interesting reading.
I was just going to say that's something that I, again, have to particularly watch in my own writing. And it often has to do with how well it is I understand what I'm writing about. The better command I have over it, the easier it is for me to write it in short, clear sentences. When I start adding multiple clauses and longer explanations and qualifications, it's probably because I didn't say it quite the right way the first time.
Yeah, and I run into that a lot when I'm editing. You can just tell when an author is just trying to get the idea out. And so sometimes that means multiple sentences in a row that are somewhat repetitive, but oftentimes you do see it in those longer sentence structures because they're just, they're gearing themselves up and trying to get it out, and a lot of times all you have to do is flag that for the author and they'll just be like, oh yeah, okay. If you just say, hey, what's the root of what you're trying to say here? Oftentimes they'll respond in a comment so much more clearly than how they wrote it in the actual paper or article. And you say, yes, that's exactly it. Now just copy and paste that and put that in your Word document. But it is a really hard thing to identify in your own writing. Another thing that's really difficult to identify in your own writing is when you've made a sentence overly complicated, not in terms of being multi-clausal, but just in terms of how you're constructing the actual sentence. So I have a great example. I think it's a great example, and it's pretty simple. I had an author write this, and what they wrote was it allowed them to have a recognition of the consequences of their actions. So to have a recognition of, and I just changed it to recognize. Simpler, it allowed them to recognize the consequences of their actions. So a lot of times that kind of seeing if you can, fewer words isn't always better, but a lot of times it can be, especially if you get these overly complicated with different prepositions and stuff. So that's something that's really hard to identify in your own writing, but something to keep in mind as you are writing. And then one more thing to consider when you're writing, and I touched on this a little bit earlier when I mentioned the signposting, but is to use connective tissue in your prose. That can just be simple words like therefore, or moreover, or given that X, Y, Z. Sometimes authors, because they're trying to be so straightforward and clear, they'll just kind of, their article can start to read like bullet points, just like boom, 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 boom. But you want there to be a flow. You want to compose the music in such a way that it's pleasing to the ear. But it also will help your reader track along with you to do that.
So I think we've covered the high points of the 5 W's and the how. So we talked about who, we talked about where, we talked about what, why, when. We talked extensively about how. But we haven't gotten to what I think a lot of readers really want to know, which is, Megan, what are your top pet peeves in writing?
Well, jargon is definitely one of them. I mean, when someone writes exogenous, I just kind of start twitching a little bit. And Doyle can attest to that because, he gets to hear me complain about it. So I think jargon is a really big one. Another thing that bothers me, and this isn't quite so much about writing per se, but lack of citations. That really drives me crazy when people make assertions or refer to a body of literature or this, that, or the other, and they don't leave a citation on it. That drives me crazy. And that's an easy fix. I mean, that's a really easy fix, but that's something that drives me a little bit crazy. What about you, Doyle?
So I think one very specific one is the word use versus the word utilize. And I have a military background, and in the military, there tends to be this assumption that if you just say you're using something, that can't possibly be as good or interesting as utilize. But I have rarely, if ever, seen circumstances under which utilize was the correct choice of a word when they were doing that. I think the other one that comes in, and this actually also, I'll use it as a segue to sort of the concluding thing, is when an author wants to argue with the editor, not about things that have to do with the substance of their argument, because it is absolutely the author's argument, and the author needs to express that as clearly as possible. But when an author gets upset about style guide issues, for example, as it relates to capitalization or punctuation or things like that, it's frustrating because it's so challenging anyway. Writing is intellectual labor. Your identity is tied up in it. I get it. And now you've turned this over to someone else who said, yeah, this is good, but we can make it better. And that's our job description. But that process is not easy if someone is attached to things that aren't substantive. And that can make it a very challenging process.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The editing process is a really delicate, a very sensitive, and a very vulnerable thing for writers. And a good editor knows that. But I think as much as possible, try to view your editor as your friend, as someone who really is looking out for your best interests, is not trying to change your arguments, but is trying to make sure that your arguments get across as clearly as possible. A good editor is trying to protect their publication, but they're also trying to protect the author. They're trying, when I'm editing somebody, I'm trying to anticipate what the most hostile reader is going to pick at and say, well, you didn't say this here, or you said that there. I'm trying to help you not have people on Twitter nitpick about like little things in your article. So be open to it. Be open to your editor.
So this actually reminds me of a favorite story about a personal hero of mine. If I had not gone into the Navy and then gone in academia, I was interested in being a lawyer. And Thurgood Marshall is someone who I just admire enormously. And I had the opportunity when I was a midshipman, taking a constitutional law class at the Naval Academy, to listen to arguments at the Supreme Court, and Marshall was on the court. And a lawyer was making his case, and Marshall interrupted him to ask a question. And the lawyer impatiently said, "No, Your Honor, you misunderstand." And Marshall slid his glasses down to the end of his nose and looked over him and said, "I most certainly do." And it suddenly became clear that the lawyer's like, oh, hey, it's my job to make you understand. And that's what editors are trying to do, is to help you as an author ensure that your reader understands. Because if your reader misunderstands, it's not a fault of the reader. It's a fault of the ability to communicate the idea in the clearest and most persuasive way possible.
That's right. And if your editor is having a hard time, I know I said this at the beginning, but it's worth repeating. If your editor is having a hard time understanding you, and your editor is trying really, really hard to discern what you're saying, then a reader is going to have a really hard time. You need to trust your editor that they're telling you the truth when they say, "Hey, this isn't clear." Believe them, and don't say, "Well, what's not clear about it?" Just try to repackage it. But that said, like I'm saying, trust your editor and work with them and believe them and everything like that. But that doesn't mean you can't push back. A good editing process is a negotiation. It's a conversation. You're having a back and forth. I had an article I was working on a few months ago, and I had deleted a sentence because it just seemed superfluous, and I thought it was just maybe a little too cute. And And the author came back and just really nicely just said, hey, I love that sentence, actually. Like, I was actually really excited about that sentence, and I was like, oh, totally. Okay. There was nothing wrong with the sentence. It wasn't ungrammatical. It wasn't off topic. It just seemed unnecessary. But the author comes back and says, hey, this one's really important to me. Absolutely. Like, we work with the authors and go back and forth. And it should be a conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I think that just about takes us to the end of our time. I hope that these comments are useful. As I said, certainly for scholars who are thinking about submitting, for people in the policy world who are thinking about submitting to War on the Rocks, but I think also to anyone who engages in written communication as part of their job, these principles are useful in terms of how it is that you can most clearly and persuasively make your case. And I think focusing on the basics, whether that's tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, or answering the 5 questions: who, where, what, why, when, and how, signposting what's going to be in there, and looking for the simplest way to explain the argument that doesn't lose the nuance that's in there. These things are applicable to writing in almost any field, even if there are different disciplinary norms. So Megan, it's been a great pleasure to actually have you on Horns.
No, it was great to be here. Really glad to get to discuss this topic, which is my favorite thing to talk about, as Doyle knows. So yeah, that's a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.